Hello, this is Vlad and a new story from my channel, Amazing Story. Galina somehow grew up with the idea that she was always responsible for someone. She was only 7 when her mother died in a fire. And although Galina was visiting her grandparents in a neighboring village at the time, her father later complained. "Why did you come visiting at such a bad time? Didn't you love your mother? Well, then, don't bother shedding fake tears." Quote, "Don't listen to him. It was because of your father that Mom suffered. He'd been planning to leave her for another woman for a long time. She lived, poor thing, on sedatives. That's probably why she couldn't save herself." That's what her grandparents told their little granddaughter. Gallia tried to believe them, but she still often dreamed at night that she was saving her mother. "She will be," she said, and leading her out of the fire. Her mother was good, kind, and beautiful, although weak-willed, and would burst into tears at the slightest provocation. Gallia resembled her in appearance. A short, blonde woman with full lips, an upturned nose, blue doll-like eyes, and a high forehead. But in character, as her grandfather said, she was a true fighter, decisive, ready to stand up for those who were being bullied, but also for herself. Despite her slight frame and modest size, Galina always loved sports. She dreamed of joining the Ministry of Emergency Situations or the police. She wanted to save people, come to the rescue, and even take risks. But life turned out differently. When she was almost 16, her grandparents passed away in the same year. Her father had long since forgotten about Gallia. He said she brought back bad memories. Eventually, she ended up in an orphanage. All the girls there were taught to sew, as was the tradition. So, Gallia, despite herself, left the orphanage a trained seamstress. The state only gave her an old house in the middle of nowhere, and what remained of her grandparents had long since been sold by savvy relatives. She had nothing to live on. Gallia couldn't count on anyone's help. She was forced to immediately find work as a seamstress. She managed to do this in a small atelier. For a while, she tried to sell the house and buy at least a room, but her only place to live was in such a state that renovating it was pointless. It would have been too expensive, and land in those parts was worth pennies. There were no good roads nearby, and none were expected, and electricity was inconsistent. No cottage developments or other improvements were expected nearby. So Galina decided to leave the house in the care of a neighbor for now. She rented a modest room for 2 with another seamstress. "Galina, have you noticed? That redhead has his eye on you. He always brings some nonsense to be hemmed and leaves such tips." For the first time, Tatiana noticed that her partner was being courted by a tall, stooped young man with cunning gray eyes. "Oh, Tanya, it's really not the time to be thinking about marriage. You know yourself, I'm a bride without a place. Nobody wants that kind. So even if this Igor is eyeing me, it'll be until he finds out I'm a brownie and have a dilapidated house," Gallia sighed. It wasn't that she didn't like the guy at all. He was charming in his own way, trying to lighten the mood. He talked a lot about how much he loved his mother. Gallia thought this was a good sign. It meant Igor was ready for family life and respected women in general. She also liked the way the young man looked at her as if she were truly beautiful, almost a princess. Admiration is hardly faked. He looked at her like that. Well, except maybe Lyoshka, who always stood up for her at the orphanage. But that was a childhood love. Then Alexei was adopted, apparently into some wealthy family, and he kept promising to return and marry her when they both grew up. At first, Gallia even believed that this was exactly what would happen. But years passed, and there was no news from Lyosha, so she buried her first touching childhood love in her heart. "Well, watch out, if you throw it away, you'll miss out on a good guy." Tanya had said this to her friend admonishingly many times. And one day, Galia thought, well, it won't be bad if she accepts Igor's invitation and has coffee with him at the nearest cafe. "But I'll pay for myself. Don't think I'm some kind of person." Galina immediately decided to clarify the situation and said she had nothing in mind. But she still only considered serious relationships, and she wasn't interested in all sorts of flings. "And what made you think I was chasing someone? By the way, I'm looking for a wife and a mother for my future children. I don't care whether you're rich or poor. You know, I even once figured out that rich women are unlikely to work in such a modest studio." After these words, Gal's heart warmed a little more, and she decided to forever part with thoughts of her first childhood love, with a dream that Lyoshka would ever return. Igor was reserved, serious, and at the same time caring and easygoing. He helped her with everything, and meeting his mother proved decisive. Nina Ivanovna even had tears of delight in her eyes when she saw a modest, decent, blonde girl with a braid, who also knew her way around the house. She immediately rushed to help around the house. "This is the kind of daughter-in-law I was waiting for. Now you can die in peace. Move in with us quickly, my dear. I hope my excited son has already proposed to you," asked the future mother-in-law. "Mom, what are you really saying?" "Oh, of course, I asked Galia to marry me, otherwise I wouldn't have brought her to meet you," Igor blushed. And then everything was like a fairy tale. They celebrated a modest but joyful wedding, and the newlyweds settled into a separate room. Nina Ivanovna stayed out of their lives, and was delighted when, a year later, the couple had a daughter, a redhead who looked just like her father. Nina Ivanovna worked as a manager in Yesly, and when Kasyusha grew up a little, she helped her get a job there. Igor worked as an engineer at the factory. And Galia began taking on tailoring orders so she could spend more time with her family. Everything worked out well under her. Her mother-in-law couldn't stop admiring how lucky they were with her daughter-in-law and hoped that soon the family would have a grandson. "Then I'll definitely quit my job and spend all my time with my grandchildren," Nina Ivanovna promised. Galia didn't know why such happiness had befallen her. She felt she'd found a real family, the kind she'd never had. That was until she overheard the fateful conversation between her husband's mothers-in-law. She'd come home from work early that day. Her daughter had been ill and quickly fell asleep. Galia simply lay quietly next to her child, turning off the light, and dozed off, hugging her. The excited voices of Nina Ivanovna and Igor woke her. "Mom, it's time to act. Otherwise, why did I even bring this country hen into the house and pretend she's the best?" "Igor, but Galina and her aunt are only dying. We need to be careful so your wife doesn't suspect a thing and voluntarily hands over all that inheritance. She believes we're crazy about her." Quote. Nina Ivanovna whispered this in an unpleasant, hissing voice. Galia even shuddered. She thought only a rattlesnake about to attack would speak that way. "Mom, you know all those sweet simpletons. As soon as she finds out about the inheritance, she'll be all over it. She might even get a divorce before her aunt even dies. Has that ever occurred to you?" Quote. Iker asked with a caustic, angry intonation that Galia had never heard before, as if he were a stranger. "And what are you suggesting? You think an accident is the solution? What if someone suspects something?" Quote. Nina Ivanovna asked. "Mom, no one's going to hit her and kill her. I'll come to the hospital and play the caring husband. It's important that she's immobilized for at least 6 months. Well, and then we'll see how it goes." Quote. Igor said the last sentence with a particularly unkind intonation. "Well, if this person is reliable," Nina Ivanovna added something else under her breath. Galia's arms and legs began to shake. She felt like a small animal caught in a trap. Okay, so that's what it was. So it was all for some kind of inheritance. Galia remembered that her mother did have a sister. Long ago, Ina had married well abroad. The sisters had quarreled and stopped communicating. Only once had Galina received a miracle doll dressed as a princess from her aunt, but her father had angrily thrown it into the oven and said something nasty about Galina being a woman of unremarkable character who had sold herself out for all sorts of material goods. Then, for the first time in her life, Mom had argued with Dad, crying bitterly and saying she should have listened to Ina and not gotten involved with him. Dad had hit her then, although he usually only tormented her with words, saying nasty things and cheating on her. No one ever spoke about Aunt Ina again. But how could it be that her own mother-in-law and husband knew more about it than she did? And how could she be such a simpleton? Why didn't she notice the pretense? And most importantly, what should she do now? "Look, yours has already arrived." Or maybe she heard that. Her mother-in-law's frightened voice rang out. "I'll take a look," her husband said cautiously. Galia was incredibly glad the light was off. She closed the door tighter, jumped into bed, and pretended to be fast asleep, even snoring. Her husband always laughed that Galia slept so soundly that no one could wake her. He quietly called her name several times, but Galia only snored a little louder. "Yes, she's asleep. Why did she show up so early? How come we didn't notice, huh?" Quote, Iker said with relief. And Galina decided there was no point in waiting. She didn't know exactly when the accident was supposed to be staged. In the morning, when her mother-in-law and husband left for work, she packed her things, withdrew her savings, and went to the only place where at least someone was waiting for her. That same little house in the middle of nowhere. "Mom, is Dad going to take us? What are we going to tell Grandma?" Quote, Kasyusha asked a lot of questions. "You see, it's a game. You like strands, right?" Quote, her daughter nodded and smiled. "Well, we'll hide from Grandma and Dad, and then they'll be so happy that we've been found," Galia tried to explain. She knew the idea sounded strange, but she could only hope her daughter wouldn't sense her fear. "But they love us, huh?" Kasyusha said doubtfully. "Of course, but adults like to play sometimes too," Galina said. The little girl thought for a moment, but didn't ask any more questions. And Galia was glad that she'd managed to bring down her fever the day before. Kasyusha had miraculously recovered by morning, as if fate itself was helping them. They had to turn off the phone. Otherwise, how could she explain to her husband that she had run away and never wanted to see him again? He was no longer a family member, but a stranger posing a threat to life and limb, some kind of treacherous hypocrite. Gal couldn't think of anything better to do than leave a note. "I'm sorry. There comes a time in every couple's life when they have to think about what's next. You're a good person, but we've reached a dead end. I'll stay with a friend for now. You don't know her. Don't look for me, or we'll get divorced even faster." Quote. She wanted to add that she knew everything, but then decided not to risk it. The note, as it stood, could be interpreted in any number of ways. Perhaps she had fallen in love with someone else, or perhaps she suspected her husband of being a Mina, or perhaps she had somehow learned of the inheritance. Igor and his mother didn't know what she meant, which meant they would tread carefully. That was exactly what Galya needed right now. Alexei thought his life hadn't turned out the way he'd dreamed. He thought he'd been taken from the orphanage to a respectable family. But it turned out the apartment was littered with antiques for a reason. His adoptive parents had chosen him for his naive face and sharp mind. They were trying to raise him to be a thief. Okay, son, time to earn your keep. That's what his adoptive father had said a couple of years after he'd been adopted and taken to a distant southern city. Okay, I'm ready to help. I'm not afraid of work. Lyosha hadn't yet imagined what the conversation would even involve. Excellent. His adoptive father explained that he'd have to stand guard outside a cottage and signal if anyone showed any particular interest. Skills needed to be developed gradually. When the time came, I'd give you a more challenging task. You'll be young and rich. All the girls will be yours. So what does that mean? I'll be a thief? Alexei was a truly smart kid. The foster father laughed. It finally got through. You'll be like everyone else in our dynasty. Or dress as you please. But if you have to get your hands dirty, we're not like that. So much as utter a word and you'll be finished, the tall, dark-haired man threatened. Lyosha didn't know what to do. He pretended to agree to help, and then simply ran away. He was afraid to return to the orphanage, knowing his foster parents had long arms and great connections. He wandered around for a while, taking any job he could, and when, a few years later, he finally got his documents back and was about to find his first love, he was very unlucky. A shortage was discovered at the store where he worked in the warehouse. And before Alexei knew it, he was framed. They testified against him. No one really bothered to figure out whether the boy was actually guilty. The orphan was extremely suspicious to those around him, and that was enough. So Alexei found himself behind bars as soon as he came of age. He served a considerable sentence, and when he got out, he decided to find Galina again. He knew she probably wouldn't want him with his past, but he still wanted to catch a glimpse of her. Well, she's apparently married and doesn't live in the house. She does have an address. Quote, if you want, you can ask there, said a mutual friend from the orphanage. Alexei did just that. In the village, they told him an elderly neighbor had been looking after the house, but she had recently died. If he knew Galina, he could certainly live there. But he couldn't cause trouble. The villagers wouldn't tolerate it. Alexei had no plans to. While he was alive, he repaired everything he could, fixed all the furniture, then found a part-time job and quietly lived, hoping to explain himself to his beloved. Even if she was now married. Lesha didn't want Galya to think he couldn't keep his word. She needed to know he was planning to come back for her. But fate had turned otherwise. Look, the light in the window is on. Could Aunt Natasha really be spending the night there? Galya wondered if her neighbor was staying in her house. The elderly woman made a point of not using the telephone. And she hadn't had a daughter-in-law for 3 months. Besides, she didn't really talk to anyone. Quote, she's a good girl, Kasyusha asked. Very. And what delicious pies does she bake? Galya was pleased that she and her daughter would come to a warm house, where someone was sincerely waiting for them. She dreaded the thought of chopping wood and stoking the stove after a long, bumpy bus ride and a long walk. She had to knock. Kasyusha was small but polite. She barely made a sound when she tugged the ring on the handle. The door swung open, and a short, dark-haired man appeared on the threshold, clearly as stunned by Galia's appearance as she was. Despite the passage of time, Galia recognized him immediately, and her heart suddenly began to beat faster, as if they were still children in love. Apparently, he felt the same way. Alexei's face flushed burgundy, his hands became stained. Quote, "Galia, are you really married, really?" Alexei asked with a bitter smile. "I don't even know anymore," she sighed. "I have a lot to tell you, but first, eat something after my journey. And I'm not much of a cook, of course, but, can you imagine, I waited for you every day." Alexei was telling the truth. Every day he cooked something modest in the hope that one day she would come. 3 months of waiting didn't seem so long to him. Galia had finally appeared, and her words about it being unknown whether she was married or not sounded like the best and most desirable thing for Lyosha. "Look, I need to find this aunt's number. I have friends who can help. Maybe she's still alive." An elderly lawyer, who believed in the boy's innocence, had helped Alexei secure early release. It was this Ivan Petrovich he was planning to call. Quote, "Let's try. I'm glad things are working out for you on the personal front," the elderly lawyer said. He was worried about Alexei, who had promised to call if there were any problems, but then disappeared altogether. The very next day, Ivan Petrovich arrived in person and brought all the necessary information. Galia's aunt, it turned out, had been living in Moscow for a long time. Her affairs, however, were bad, and she longed to see her niece before she died. Quote, "We need to go right now. I don't know how much time she has left," Ivan Petrovich said. "So how are we supposed to get there? The bus isn't even running today," Galia sighed. "Well, your aunt has a personal driver. By the way, I came with him," the older man smiled. Galia and Alexei couldn't believe their luck. Just half an hour after they left, Igor and Nina Ivanovna rushed in. With them were 2 suspicious, broad-shouldered men with no trace of intelligence, who had orders to take Galina and Kasiusha back, even if they objected. Quote, "Well, we're late." "It's all for nothing," Igor said angrily, learning that Beglanok and some other guy had been whisked away in a luxury car. She'd already started an affair, only pretending to be a poor lamb. At that very moment, Galia, Kasiusha, Lyosha, and Ivan Petrovich were on their way to Aunt Galia's. She burst into tears when she saw not only her niece but also her daughter, and said she deeply regretted the fight with her sister. Quote, "Your mother fell in love with a toy, and I wanted to stop her. But who listened to me? And your father said, choose, either me or her. So I decided Tura wouldn't call, she'd come crawling back. And then I found out she was gone. It was so stupid." Overjoyed, Aunt Ina seemed to change her mind about dying. But she did help Galina with the divorce. And only then did she buy her an apartment and help her open her own studio. Well, she didn't help her sister, but at least she saved her niece. That's what she said. Igor tried to juggle his rights to little Kasiusha and extort money, but an experienced lawyer and detective quickly explained to him that these games would cost him dearly. There was all the evidence that there had been an attempt on Galtov's life, so giving up custody of his daughter was the lesser of 2 evils. "Look, do you mind if I stay in that old house? I have nowhere to go right now. They haven't given me any housing. I ran away," Alexei said. He helped her resolve all her issues, but he didn't want to impose himself, since now she didn't need rescuing. "Do you have someone?" "I was thinking." Galia blushed. She hoped that Lyoshka would remain in her life forever. But I'm a beggar, and I was in prison. I just didn't want to ruin your life. Quote. Lyosha blushed. He didn't know how to tear this love from his heart. And there's no need to ruin it. I've already managed to prove that they imprisoned you for nothing, so I'll take on your education. You'll be a fine wife. You're also entitled to compensation for this time. Ivan Petrovich appeared from nowhere behind them. For the first time, he told me that he himself had come from an orphanage, which is why he decided to help a modest, honest guy who reminded him of himself in his youth. So maybe I don't have the talent? Alexei beamed like a copper kettle at the good news, but still tried to decline out of politeness. You have to try first, and only then draw conclusions, Ivan Petrovich said instructively. And after some time, when Lyosha had outpaced many students and was still raising Kasyusha and Mishka, his newborn son from his beloved wife, he was convinced there was no point in losing hope. It makes sense to fight for happiness with all the strength you have. If you like the story, please support me with a thumbs up button. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you.